Hello and welcome back to the channel where once again it's time for another Saturn versus PlayStation video, with today's video being the 19th comparison in the series. Currently the PlayStation has an 11-7 lead, and with this week's game being Street Fighter Alpha 2, optimism will be high that the Saturn will be able to pull another point back in the series. So if you are completely new to this series, what I do is I compare a game from the Saturn's library against a game from the PlayStation's library. Sometimes it will be like for like, sometimes it will be games that are exclusive to both systems, and I compare them in terms of visual, sound, gameplay, content and lifespan, and then ultimately come up with a winner. So like always, I'm going to start with visuals first, and we're going to start with the PlayStation version of Street Fighter Alpha 2 because it did come out a few weeks before the Saturn version, and I'm going to point out that from now on we will be covering NTSC format games only, simply because I think it's fairer in terms of comparisons. When you cover PAL games, you have to remember they were optimized to different levels, so I don't necessarily think it's as fair a comparison as it should be. So moving forward, we will be exclusively looking at NTSC versions, unless of course they are PAL specific games. Now, in terms of visuals, a lot of people always considered the Saturn to have an advantage in terms of 2D games, especially when it uses its RAM expansion cartridge. But of course, Street Fighter Alpha 2 doesn't use that, so it is the base Saturn against the PlayStation, and the PlayStation version of Street Fighter Alpha 2 is actually a very good looking game. For me, it looks absolutely brilliant. The characters look great, the backgrounds look great, the color is fantastic, all of the specials and the super moves look fantastic as well, and it runs flawlessly as far as I'm concerned. It really is a brilliant looking 2D PlayStation game. So moving across to the Saturn version for quality of visuals, and if you played one version directly after the other, I think you would be hard pushed to tell them apart because both versions look incredibly similar. In fact, so similar, I would struggle to tell them apart at all in terms of their graphical footage within the gameplay. The animations, the quality of visuals, the backdrops, they all pretty much look as good as each other. But the Saturn does have two direct improvements over the PlayStation version. First of all, the introduction video on the Saturn is of considerably higher quality than the PlayStation version. For what reason, I don't know. A lot of the times when we saw video sequences within the two systems, they genuinely looked better on the PlayStation. The second difference is of course the main menu, because on the Saturn it has a backdrop, whereas on the PlayStation it is simply dark black. But that for me is the only two direct noticeable differences between the games visually, but it does mean that the Saturn comes out on top in terms of visuals. So moving on to the sound effects and music next, and for me, Street Fighter games in general have always sounded very strong, certainly from my own experience anyway, and Street Fighter Alpha 2 is no exception. Whether you're talking about the sound effects or the music, I feel they're of a very high quality, whether you're playing either the PlayStation or the Saturn version. In fact, I think it's practically impossible to tell any differences between the two. The only difference that there is the audio format for the music within the game, with the PlayStation version using XA audio and the Saturn version using ADPCM. What this means is the Saturn music can actually loop through and keep playing, but this really isn't an issue in the game whatsoever, so I am going to say it's a tie in terms of sound effects and music. But what I will do though is still give you some examples of the quality music within the game. So moving on to the gameplay next, and probably the most controversial area in some of these videos that I do is the gameplay, because it basically boils down to a control pad preference. The characters have got the same moves and the same super moves on either version, and they're pulled off by inputting the same commands. But for me, a standard Sega Saturn control pad has a superior D-pad and button layout for a 6-button fighting game like this than the PlayStation control pad. Yes, you can go out and buy third-party control pads or control sticks for both versions of the game, but I don't think that's fair to take into account when you're comparing them. I think when I do my comparisons videos, I'm much better off assuming that I'm going to be using a standard PlayStation digital pad or analog pad, or a Saturn digital pad or the analog pad for that, and comparing them in that regard. And in this way, the Saturn version plays superior to me, simply because the standard Sega Saturn control pads are better for 2D fighting games than the PlayStation ones. So moving on to content and lifespan next, and one thing that cannot be argued by anybody is the gulf between the two versions in this area, because the Saturn version has 3 extra characters in the form of Evil Ryu, the original Dalsim, and the original Zangief characters, as well as a survival mode and an art gallery mode as well. I think it's unbelievable that the PlayStation version is missing all of this stuff, despite the games coming out at relatively the same period in time. So of course it means the Saturn has an overwhelming victory in terms of content and lifespan. Now, of course, that leaves me with my final question: which version is the best one overall? And I don't think anybody will be able to disagree when I say the Sega Saturn version of Street Fighter Alpha 2 is considerably better than the PlayStation version. More content is really the primary thing, although it does have some slight visual improvements as well. Of course, this means the Saturn has now pulled it back to 11-8 in favor of the PlayStation. Like always, let me know your thoughts down below on the two versions. If I've missed anything out, this is something that I always like to point out. I am by no means a knowledge fountain of every single thing about every single game that I compare. I usually go for the most direct, noticeable differences between the games, and I may well have missed some things out. If I have, of course, let me know down below with a comment, and like always, I'll be back in the near future with another video. Goodbye for now.